Welcome back to another episode of We Do the Heavy Lifting. I'm your host, Dr. Jenny Yentis, and today we do substance abuse. So a lot of us probably think through and know what substance abuse, or in our mind have an idea of what that's like. And substance abuse is something that we may or may not associate with college and universities. And sometimes that's our first experience as being an adult and not being very supervised. So what really happens, and how do we have support systems in place for these for individuals that may end up down a path of substance abuse? So today, I'm really excited. Our expert is Dr. Ben Montemayor, and he is from Texas A&M University. You are in the Department of Health Behavior.
Correct.
In the School of Public Health. Lots of health there.
Yes.
And I am actually going to start off by asking you a pretty simple question, because you are what you call yourself, a behavior social scientist.
Yes.
What in the world is that?
Okay, so for those who maybe are unfamiliar with the term, it's someone who kind of navigates and researches behaviors from a social lens, not so much a physiological and or like data point driven, where we collect like single item data from people. It's a social lens of research where we collect multitudes of data from a lot of people, whether it's survey, observation, interviews. It's quantitative and qualitative, and we study behaviors from a social, economical, social, environmental standpoint. Mm-hmm. And then from that point, we use what we've gathered to either help the individual with programming, interventions, however is the most feasible way to approach whatever issue we're trying to target. In my case, substance use, but there's social behavioral scientists and LGBTQ research, physical activity, you name it, it exists. But for me, it's specifically substance use and adolescents and young adults. So that's how I approach my research, and my kind of data collection is from a social lens, where we either have them do surveys and or interviews, and we kind of look at this data as cross-sectional in the time being, but we can make it longitudinal if we need to.
Okay, so for our listeners, cross-sectional means just looking at it right at one time point.
Right, if you get a survey, and for listeners who get surveys in emails, in mail, that is a cross-sectional data point. It's when you fill it out right then and there, and either you submit it or you send it back to whomever you're sending it to. Okay. That's a cross-sectional data point where it's just right then and there. And if you do it longitudinally, which means you get it again in maybe 3 or 6 months, that's longitudinal data with a cross-sectional survey.
Yeah. So you're basically tracking somebody over time.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. So you could look at it one time point or lots of time points. And so the social science, if I'm understanding correctly, you're looking at basically a position, like you're not just looking at the person as just this person in a vacuum. You're looking at how their behavior is in an entire society.
Within the context of a society, right?
Okay.
So it's not so much just, and one of the reasons that I consider myself this is because I look at social environmental items, cultural items, city, state. We live in a place where it's different than any other place. So what are those social cues that we're receiving from unofficially through friends, through peers, and does that impact what we learn, or does that even go against what we learned as an adolescent growing up in a very different household? Like, it's all these things trigger actions. Yeah. So my interest is understanding how is it triggering those actions, and what are our thought processes and our behaviors as a result of that. Okay,
so that leads me into my next question, which is really focused on your research is in, like you said, substance abuse in adolescents and young adults. I kind of want to talk to you. A lot of our listeners are college age. Mm-hmm. So I kind of want to focus a bit more, but adolescence leads into college.
Sure.
So feel free to talk about them all. But you said how those behaviors in adolescence, or what you learned in adolescence changes. So kind of like, what is that prevalence, or how common is it for somebody to end up as I don't know the right term, so correct me if I'm wrong, a substance abuser? Is that correct?
So we're typically, in our field, we stay away from the term abuse now because of the stigma associated with it. So a substance user, a substance misuser, and or if it's on the extreme end, those who suffer from a substance use disorder.
Okay.
So
much better.
Everyone,
Thank you.
It's a learning point for it's relatively, and it swings. It's new. The the manuals that we use to diagnose these things change, not often, but they'll have amendments that said, let's stay away from this terminology because of the stigma associated with it.
Absolutely. I know that I've been changing how I address persons that have followed through with a suicide.
Yes.
So it's like, instead of putting the onus on the person, it's like committing something.
Yes.
So it's kind of the same thing. I get that. So could you talk a little bit about how culture, environment, that sort of thing may influence the actions as you were sort of starting to allude to earlier?
Right. So I'm from a tiny town, much like a lot of students here from small rural Texas who are then, we grew up with our own cultural, spiritual, religious, whatever you name it, values. And from that, we learn, and at the age of 18 we're asked to basically become an adult and leave and fly the coop and go elsewhere. It's when then we surrounded ourselves with, like, say for example here with our 60,000 plus population in university, if you graduated with the class of 25 like I did, and we come to a place that's my first year courses have 200 to 300 people in there. That is it's shocking. But so that's just from the academic part. When you go to like a behavioral part, you're then kind of learning these new behaviors for the first time, and or maybe not for the first time, but now you're no longer with the people you grew up with. You're with new people. You're kind of trying to adapt to these new social norms that could include drinking at a tailgate, which didn't exist probably until before someone was here or at any university. Because I don't know too many people who tailgate high school football games, right? So maybe
it is Texas, though.
Sure, yeah. I've seen Friday Night Lights, so I get it. But here, these social norms, it's not that anyone's saying that it's okay. It's that we're not saying not to do it. So it's almost like we're inviting it. We're normalizing it, and so we're desensitized when we see thousands of people gather around a tailgate, and knowingly we know not everyone's over the age of 21, which by virtue is breaking the law. But then it's more speaking of so we know we're going to do it, and it's because we can't change the narrative so quickly. We try to, but for the most part, it's these behaviors that we didn't get to experience growing up not only challenge what we do or how we thought, but we're at this particular age from 18 through 22, normal college student, we're prone to be suspect to giving in on those behaviors.
Well, I mean, peer pressure has to be one of those risk factors.
Sure.
I don't know if you want to call it that.
Yeah.
But that has to be a huge influence to do things that you might not normally do. I mean, we know that as adults.
And peer pressure in this context isn't the way that you and I probably learned it with the videotapes, and they play the tapes for drug use is bad. They have the egg frying on the show. It says this is your brain on cannabis. It's more about it's not often that you're going to find someone directly saying do it. Let's nudge you to do it. It's more so, what does it look like if you're not doing it? Like, how do you perceive yourself fitting in? Do you think that you fit in or don't fit in? And because of that, it's like subconscious influence of I don't want to be the only one who's not doing this. And they're probably not going to judge you for not doing it. Maybe there's some nudging here and there, but ultimately I think we're a little more responsible of if you choose not to, that's fine. It's more so it's an internal thing that we have to deal with is I want to be liked and accepted. Everyone else is doing it. It's harmless for the most part if I do it responsibly. That's not always the case, but that's kind of that approach, that peer influence. But there's other things. It's the socio-cultural norms, it's traditions, it's stress. It's people going out to bars, even with expectations of I want to have fun tonight, and I have my mindset that I'm going to do this, and I'm happy. I'm looking forward to it. It's finals time where people are stressed out, and for the first time more maybe than they did in high school. I know high school has finals too, but college tends to congregate at middle semester and end semester, and then you know this more than I do, but we have these internal hormones that kind of they crave sugar, they crave these stress relief situations, they crave social contact, especially when we've been head down computers the whole time. And so that leads to drinking too, and substance use and coping and all these different items.
So are there other risk factors that might put a person at a higher, maybe that puts them in a position where they're more likely to go down that
Sure. Yeah. So some risk factors, speaking on the person, is mental health issues, and not just like issues, more so like anxiety, depression, things that by virtue, alcohol is a social lubricant. Okay. Not just because it makes you feel good and this and that. There's some physiological changes that happen in different regions of the brain that help you open up. That's why someone at a happy hour, the first drink, second drink, everyone's lively, having a good time. After you've had a few drinks, there's physiological reactions where it's a social lubricant. So then, and so other items like being in a social environment that promotes it, like for instance, a Greek organization. These, again, it's not a condemnation of anything ever, but it's more so these social contexts allow for this. So in the social context, that an internal context, it's mental health, it's stress, it's these different items. So there's different risk factors that could encourage someone or discourage someone to drink. A protective factor is the opposite end. Those who have been found to be affiliated with more of a religious background tend to drink less as they go through, and or at least they abstain longer before they start to engage in drinking. Being very involved with the community and like familial upbringings means that you're less likely to engage in binge and heavy episodic drinking. So there's different risk and protective factors, and college tends to be a time where we really start to test those factors. It could be that we grew up thinking that it's not a good thing, it's a sin, it's to drink anything ever. And then we're exposed to alcohol for the first time, maybe at the age of 18, with no one around us to question if what we're doing is right or wrong. So then we start to, those inner challenges start to really kind of pick up whether or not, or they kind of influence whether or not we engage in some behaviors.
I also think about when you go to college, that's especially for like you yourself, you said you came from a small rural town. That's the first time that you're really meeting people that have different backgrounds from yourself. And you're seeing, okay, well, they're doing it and they're fine. Like, why, So I think that that's really, you learn so much in those years. And that's one of them, is you're really learning about diversity of backgrounds and how everybody else has been raised and what they think is right and wrong. And so, yeah, it is a challenge.
Yeah, I mean, this is the time, and what I tell my students often is, don't try to rush through this. Like, not that, this is a time where you're going to grow significant. You're going to be exposed to things that are going to challenge how you grew up. And this is more philosophical, but when related to substance use, some people will be more desensitized to substance use than you were, based on your upbringing, based on how you grew up, based on where you grew up. And just your ethnicity, your racial background, all these things some of these things will change once you're in college because of your exposure to other people, and your norms and or your behaviors change as a result as well. For some.
Yeah,
for many.
Exactly. Yeah. For some, it doesn't. It reinforces, whatever they came in with. But for others, they may change, right?
Yep.
So it goes either way.
Correct.
So most of your work, when I've read some of that, is focused on prevention, or sort of, you called it risk mitigation. Could you speak a little bit about what that is? Like, how do you try to tell them, oh, it's okay not to drink? I mean, we've heard that for years. I mean, what do you mean by that?
Okay. So prevention, there's two kind of ways to approach, there's more, but the way it's prevention or harm reduction. Or risk mitigation, same synonymous. So prevention is kind of touching on like those protective factors, like how strong do you affiliate your faith or some sort of protective familial closure, proximity to substance use, because the stronger those are for people, any protective factor, the less likely they are to engage in substance use, right? So the prevention component would be to really kind of harness the power that exists in that, and also trying to challenge those risk factors, like telling them it's okay to go to a tailgate and not drink and or participate in the free plethora of alcohol that exists at this tailgate, right? So it's okay. That's the prevention approach. Now, that is more of an educational component. It's like it might be a shock to people. It's like kind of raising awareness, letting them know, like, many people have gone through what you've gone through and will go through what you're going to go through. In terms of harm reduction and risk mitigation, it's about saying, and this is kind of the scope that I live in, is the harm reduction. It's about telling them, we're not going to condemn you for doing this. We get that you're doing it. We know that it's challenging not to do it because of who you're surrounded by, and this is an age where you are meant to grow and prosper and learn your own within the confines of what you're comfortable with. But it's more about telling them, look, if you're going to do this, let's take some safeguards, let's take some precautions, and let's attack this from a place where we don't shame you, but more so we want you to be safe when you do it. An example that I often give here is, and it just happened, was ring ceremonies, right? And participating for some in a social.
Before you keep going, let's tell our listeners what a ring ceremony is, because we have listeners from all over the world.
Right. So a ring ceremony, and as a non-Aggie graduate, I can only talk about what I know.
Yes.
It's when they receive, I guess like
Class ring?
a class ring, at the end, close to the end of their academic journey here, and some they receive it, and it's a check. It's a not check mark.
It's like a feather in your cap.
Yes.
It's really important
It
here.
is, yes.
If you've never been to Texas A&M, you don't understand.
Right. And I'll be jealous
yeah.
sometimes when I'm like, okay, like I might work here for the next 8 years and I'll never get one.
I know, they seem fun.
But it's a communal thing, and they're very proud of it.
Yes.
And so as a result of when you receive this, there's a just logically a ceremonial thing that happens outside of it. So you get the ring, and that's all that we do. But sometimes they bring friends, families, et cetera, over. So I often preach around this time of year, educate around this time of year about the harm reduction techniques for the celebration of Ring Day. And for some, what they do is, anywhere between 30 to 40 ounces of a liquor is consumed, typically beer, because that's a social tradition that some people have. And so I said, okay, before you do this, have you taken the proper precautions? Have you thought about who's going to pick you up? Have you thought about who's going to drive you? Have you thought about what you're going to eat before? Have you thought about water in between your drinks? These are harm reduction techniques where we don't promote it, but if you're going to do it, how can we help you be safe about it? Again, it's you can take this behavior with anything. You can take it with sexual behavior, right? If you're going to, how can we mitigate the risk of that? So for me, it's substance use. So if you're going to consume beverages, if you're going to participate in drug use, how do we make it safe, and how do we pre-plan things to where you get home and back, or you get to your location and home in a very safe way? You minimize the risk for yourself and others. You put the onus on yourself to plan all these things out. And you free up law enforcement to do other things than try to track down where all these different parties are happening, where people are drinking uploads of 30, 40 ounces of beer in a very small amount of time.
Yeah.
Very minimal amount of time.
So I have two questions for you. One of those is sort of, can you tell us how effective like a harm reduction strategy would be compared to another strategy? And my second question, which we can come back to, is there's going to be a group of people that are going to listen to this podcast and think, well, you're giving them permission to do it. Like, I know that those people exist out there.
Sure.
So what is your response to those folks? So
Okay.
The first one is, how effective is it? And then the second one is, what is your response to the folks that are like, well, you're just giving them permission to
Sure.
go out?
So in terms of how effective prevention versus harm reduction is, so there's research that shows for those who, if you've been taught prevention and abstinence always, like if that's what you've been taught, you are likely to engage in alcohol use if you're going to, at a much later date.
Okay.
So there's this unofficial, it's called this theory of maturation, where we're on this prime age of engaging in risky behaviors. It's typically in the college years up to like 25 or so. So the more that we delay that, which abstinence and prevention education does do that, the less likely we are to get to the peak of what you would if you didn't learn this information.
Okay.
Right? So that's effective in its own sense for people who can relate to it and who want to carry that with them. Harm reduction is effective in reducing the risk associated. So it's for someone who's going through a harm reduction technique, one thing that we could do is we can screen this individual to see if they're at risk of an alcohol use disorder. There's questions we ask them. That itself is a harm reduction technique. And that might be the first time that they learn that they're ever at risk of being diagnosed with an AUD. That itself is a harm reduction technique, not so much that it's trying to scare them, like, did you know this? It's more that we're educating them that you are drinking at a level that's very risky for you, for anyone. And so what could we do to essentially minimize that risk? And this may be the first time you learn. So I wouldn't equate the two as being one more effective than the other. It's more so about meeting them where they're at in the process. Whether if you haven't started, prevention, abstinence is a strong thing to do for this, because they already have this wherewithal to basically say, I don't want to do it. And if I'm going to do it, it's challenging some things that are inside of me, so then I won't. And so they're less likely to do it anyways. And so for those who are engaging behaviors, it's meeting this person where they're at in the process and minimizing risk from then on forward.
Okay, so then my second question was, the harm reduction, as you were describing it earlier, kind of sounds like it's giving permission.
Sure.
So what's your response to those that see it from that lens?
So when it comes to, it's not that we're allowing these students or anyone to engage in a behavior, or that we're saying, we're promoting it. We're not a commercialized industry. I'm not the alcohol industry. I don't promote this. I'm not a tobacco industry or cannabis industry, a shop. I don't promote any of this. But it's more so, we know that prevention doesn't always work. Just look at any behavior that's risky. Drunk driving still a deal. Anything that you can correlate, right? So we know that it doesn't work, and it's more about just, we have to kind of accept that it is a thing that people are going to engage in, and if they're going to do it, how can we meet them and help them either reduce and or stop? There's a strong likelihood that those who are using it will reduce as a result of learning that they're at risk of an AUD, or the fact that we aren't just kind of sweeping things under the rug anymore. We said, you know what? If you're going to use cannabis, if you're going to use alcohol, let's stop hiding it and let's talk about it if you're engaging in this. Otherwise, we're going to find out when it's too late. And for those who say, like, you're giving permission, I would say it's happening for some. I'd rather us find out now. I'd rather diagnose a college student with an alcohol use disorder now, or not I diagnose them, but I'd rather help them understand they're at risk, as opposed to when they've dropped out of college and or they have a public intox and or they have a driving under the influence, because that is a trajectory that people that they do go down, unfortunately.
No, it's very important information, and I thank you for bringing a lot of this to light. And typically on this podcast, we talk about human performance or things related to like athletes or working out or something along those lines. But this is a really important topic, especially for our listeners, to sort of understand how that lens is and why it occurs at these ages.
Sure.
I mean, I'm sure we all make our own assumptions, but kind of getting it from an expert as to, what's happening, why there's this influence. And so,
well, just going off of that, I mean, if we will feed off of that for a little bit, I mean, just being associated with athletics in a team communal aspect, you go through periods of high performance and you're stuck kind of like just doing exercises and routines and practices, and whether that's on a weekly basis like a football team, or if that's a chronic sort of like cross-country basis where you have to chronically progress through the season, there's some celebrations associated with that, not just from us as viewers, clearly that happens, but from those who are doing it. They want to relieve, they want a respite from all this. So sometimes you'll find that on a Saturday or Sunday, these athletes and non-athletes will engage and do so. One of my favorite things to tell my students is, my term is called anxiety. It's not my term, it's I think it's a term that exists. It's when people wake up one morning or a morning after a night of heavy drinking with this sort of anxiety that they feel like I have a lot to do today. I have a lot that I borrowed tomorrow's problem, basically, where like I basically said, I'm gonna go ahead and like forget what I have to do in the morning and just drink tonight. And then you wake up with that anxiety, and that's a result. That's a physiological result. It's not just a feeling. It's a rebound of transmitters, where that you basically woke up and you had restless sleep. You didn't feel good, so you don't recuperate correctly. And this goes for athletes, non-athletes alike. These transmitters happen. This rebound of transmitters happen during your sleep. So you wake up with anxiety, you wake up restless, and so it knows no bounds. Alcohol is alcohol. It influences almost every organ of the body once it's consumed, and as a result, we have to adapt to it and we deal with it.
I mean, it's so true. And for the college age students listening to this, there does become an age that you get to where the things you have to do the next day do outweigh the.
You have to bar, yes.
Yeah, you're like, no, I got to get up and do that in the morning, so I'm not going to drink this other drink.
Yes.
Like there is an age where that does come into play. There's a level of responsibility that happens.
You have to. I think we call it. I call it like borrowing tomorrow's problem. Like I have to. You have to have an expectation. Like I cannot do this. Because if I do, I won't get X, Y, and Z done tomorrow, and that's a true thing for us. So
yeah, it just comes with I say age, but it comes with responsibility too. I think that's probably plays more to it than an actual biological age.
Sure, yeah. I mean, in undergrad, when I was there, I remember constantly not having to do much after a college night on Thursday. So Thursday, Friday, Saturday, I can go out and have fun. Sunday, I recover. Brunch wasn't a thing back in 2010. Yeah. It really wasn't a big deal. So then I would just do it Monday through Thursday again. So yeah, it's responsibility, and with that, you have to learn to kind of have this delayed onset of pleasure. Yeah. Where we more so like earn a few drinks at the end of the night as opposed to binge drink or heavy drink on a weekend. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot to learn, and there's a lot more to know about that. And we will leave some resources in our show notes for those that are interested. Yeah. We'll get a few of those. Is there anything you want to leave our audience with? Any last minute thoughts?
Yeah. So it's more that I study this because I have a passion for it. Whether it's from my upbringing, it's also just my own personal experiences in college, but also the way I grew up and having family who also deal with different disorders from substances. So I study this, and I think what a lot of people do is, I think what society kind of does at large is we normalize substance use because it's enjoyable. It's at a time where we can go and we have a good time with each other and this and that, and that's okay. But my passion is, I want to make sure that if you're going to engage and if you're doing this, that you don't just chalk it up to just being a part of, I'm in college, is what it is. There could be things that you are at risk of that you just chalk up to being a social normal behavior. So one of my passions is making sure that we implement screeners, making sure that we provide resources, that we don't just do a one-size-fits-all approach where we give you a prevention education program and we say, okay, like see you in 4 years, hopefully. You make it to graduation, right? So one of my biggest things is I like to assess whether college students are a result of their environment, and maybe far be it from me to chastise you for having fun and doing what people do in college sometimes, and making friends and being social and growing yourself. But if you think you're at risk of something and or these behaviors start to take over your personal and professional and academic life, then that's when you should reach out and seek help, and or just ask for someone, a local resource, like, hey, could I talk to you about these behaviors that I'm experiencing and or that I'm engaging in? And that's kind of the lens that I live in is, okay, let's see, because substance users now, heavy substance users now tend to be heavy substance users later in life. So let's see, is it a result of your environment or a result of your biological, psychological sense of self? Yeah. So.
No, that's a really good point. And for those listening, you probably speak to a physician, or you could go to almost, I'm going to say, nearly every college campus has something called CAPS, which is Counseling and Psychological Services. Right. People always think, there's got to be something wrong with me to go there. And no, absolutely not. They do so much more than just, helping you with something that you think is wrong with you. There's nothing wrong with you. It's
just something as easy as a screener can help them decide. And they're trained in diagnosis. It's not what I'm trained in. I'm a behavioral scientist. They are physicians, psych Ds. They know, they've been through this. So even something as easy as even like a health and wellness office on university campuses exists. They're there. You can contact them. Again, CAPS, the help-seeking behavior for people who potentially have an alcohol use disorder is relatively very low. So we know that they are out there, and we also know that they're not seeking help.
Okay. So. Well, thank you so much, and we appreciate you being on the podcast today. And to our listeners, thank you so much for sticking with us for another episode. And if you have any questions, comments, or suggestions on topics, please feel free to email us at huffines@tamu.edu. And We'll see you next time. Thank you.
You're welcome.
We Do the Heavy Lifting would like to send thanks to Dr. Jenna Yentes, our host, this week's guest, Dr. Benjamin Montenmayer, Tex Aggs for a recording studio, Anisha Patel as executive producer, and Dell Billings for opening and closing credits.